When we first moved to the house that we live in now, there were two pecan trees out beside it. Neither one of them were very large, but neither did either one of them bear any pecans. In fact, several years went by, and they might have had one or two, but I thought they were duds and that they just simply weren't going to work at all. Well, then, after we lived in the house for 10 years, one of those pecan trees just kaboom. I mean, we had pecans everywhere. We gave them to neighbors, family, anybody who wanted pecans could have some because it was a huge number of pecans. I said something to a lady at church about it, and she said, well, I've always heard that it takes about 20 years for a pecan tree to really bear its first crop. And thinking about how long we lived in the house and how old the house was before we moved in it, and that's probably when the tree was planted, it was about 20 years. And so finally, it did what it was supposed to do, but it did it at the right time and in the way it was supposed to do it. Jesus talks about bearing fruit at the right time in John chapter 15. He's already mentioned about how we have to abide in him because he's the vine and we are the branches. But then he mentions in the text, and as he's having this discussion, by this my Father is glorified if you bear much fruit, and so shall you be my disciples. One translation says, you will prove to be my disciples. We prove to be Jesus' disciples when we bear much fruit. And we look at Jesus, our master example of his teaching, his preaching, his discipling, his spending time with people, his compassion, his visiting and caring for those who are helpless and hopeless. And we see how we bear fruit for Jesus. And Jesus says that's how we demonstrate, that's how we prove that we are actually his disciples, because we're doing the things that Jesus did and we're bearing the fruit that Jesus bore in his life and in turn wants us to bear in our lives. As you continue on in the next sentence that Jesus mentions, he says one other thing that we bear as a disciple, and by the way, a disciple is a learner. What do we learn? We learn to bear fruit. And how do we learn that? As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Abide in my love. We learn to be a disciple, and we learn to love, and we learn to bear much fruit.